Before we start, leave a like and subscribe to Heroes of Faith for more epic Bible stories. Just as faith lights the path, your like lights up our work. There was a time when the corridors of the celestial ether knew no shadow, and the very idea of darkness was a distant and inconceivable echo. In that firmament of uninterrupted glory stood he who was the most magnificent of creations, the pinnacle of divine aesthetics, and the clearest reflection of perfection, Lucifer, the light-bearer. He was not merely adorned with rays, but forged from the very essence of dawn, a being whose presence was a living beacon, the morning star that guided the celestial choirs and whose steps resounded like the purest of melodies. Eternal justice had molded him not only with power, but with almost insurmountable charisma. His intelligence radiated like a secondary sun, and his faithfulness, in those primordial days, seemed as unwavering as the crystal mountains of heaven. No shadow of malice marred his initial light, only the brilliance of purpose and the honor of serving at the apex of the angelic hierarchy. He was the pride of the Creator, the epitome of glory, and his existence was the greatest testament to God's ability to create limitless beauty. In that era of cosmic expansion and endless hymns, the Archangel of Light ascended not by force, but by an intrinsic grace that drew multitudes of lesser angels into his orbit. The Eternal, in his unfathomable wisdom, had granted him a vast dominion, placing him at the head of countless legions, designating him as mentor, commander, and regent of light. Alongside Michael the Strong and Gabriel the Messenger, Lucifer represented the apex of angelic authority, but it was he who held the fascination, the inspiring breath that moved the celestial armies in perfect harmony. At that zenith of his glory, his light was so powerful that it seemed to swallow the light of the dawns, and his name was synonymous with excellence and zealous obedience. The narrator of the ancient saga sees in this peak the fatal inflection point, the dizzying height, where unrestricted recognition begins to whisper the lie of self-sufficiency, planting the seed of ruin where before there was only adoration. The transition from humble admiration to corrosive pride was slow, almost imperceptible, a subtle disease of the soul that only an omniscient narrator can discern. The light-bearer began to contemplate not the giver of his beauty, but beauty itself, mirrored in his own being. Comparison, that silent plague, nested in his brilliant mind. He was superior in splendor, in eloquence, in intellect. No one in the vast celestial realms equaled his majesty. And with this perception of unparalleled singularity arose the philosophical question that would become the furnace of rebellion. If I am the greatest, why does authority reside in another? Why not me, the throne and absolute control? Obedience, once a pleasure, became a burden, a restriction unworthy of his excellence. The archangel's heart, once a temple of praise, began to be consumed by the silent fire of unsanctified ambition. The final rupture occurred when the eternal Creator unveiled humanity's plan. Beings made of clay and breath, destined to walk in freedom and love, elevated to a position of centrality in the divine cosmos. Lucifer's indignation was a seismic shock that coursed through his radiant soul. How could creatures of matter, beings inferior in essence and power, receive privileges and attention that not even he, the jewel of creation, possessed in fullness? Lucifer's glory seemed diminished, overshadowed by the prospect of a divine love that inclined towards the fragile and imperfect. Resentment, like a slow poison, transformed into a burning and calculating ambition. He began to gather those angels who blindly admired him, weaving a rhetoric of freedom and evolution, promising a new kingdom where light would emanate from all, but undeniably would be coordinated by his own star. The war, before being fought with swords, had already begun in the silent theater of angelic will. Lucifer's seductive rhetoric was a melody of discord, a siren song promising sovereignty and liberation from the shackles of obedience. He did not openly preach evil, but rather a cosmic justice, where merit and beauty should dictate power. A third of the celestial hosts, dazzled by his charisma and convinced by his impeccable logic about angelic superiority, adhered to his vision of a remade cosmos. The omniscient narrator reveals that most of these angels were not moved by innate malice, but by an induced error of judgment, a dazzlement by the light that promised total autonomy. The rebellion, once a whisper in the crystal corridors, became a thunderclap about to explode. Lucifer saw, with icy satisfaction, that he had finally found his true potential, not as the most brilliant servant, but as the unquestionable sovereign of a new domain. His ambition was no longer just a thought, but an army, ready to challenge the established order. The confrontation was not a mere debate, but a clash of wills at the heart of creation. Lucifer, inflamed by absolute pride, raised his crystal voice before the throne, demanding not only recognition, but equality of power. He desired a throne that would divide the dominion of heaven, claiming the right to rule over what he believed he had surpassed in brilliance and intellect. The silence that followed was heavier than 1,000 thunderclaps, the pause before the immutable decree. The Eternal's answer was non-negotiable, a verdict that echoed through eternity. The kingdom of light would not be divided, for sovereignty and absolute justice could not coexist with unbridled ambition. At that instant, Lucifer's choice sealed his fate. The Creator's inalienable right to full dominion was the insurmountable barrier that transformed the light-bearer into the adversary. Then the war broke out, not only of force, but of light against light, of fidelity against betrayal. Michael, the loyal archangel, whose name meant "who is like God," rose with the authority of perfect obedience to confront the fallen star. The celestial battle was a spectacle of pain and majesty, where Lucifer's conviction, tinged with his pride, fought against the unshakable divine order. The epic narrator describes the fervor of the rebellious archangel, who fought with an almost heroic belief that he was correcting a cosmic injustice. But his own light, once pure and radiant, began to be contaminated by the burning fire of his choices and bitter resentment. He was fighting against the very source of his being, and such a battle could never be won. His power was vast, but the force of truth and divine order was infinite. Lucifer's defeat was not a stumble, but an annihilation of his original glory. The decree of expulsion was an act of cosmic justice, a separation of what was perfect from what had become corrupted. The light-bearer was cast from the zenith into the abyss in a fall that seemed to last centuries, a dizzying plunge into the deepest darkness. His light shattered, breaking into countless fragments of pain and humiliation, and the beauty that once reflected the Creator's perfection contorted into an image of wrath and despair. Upon reaching the bottom of the abyss, silence did not welcome him, but rather an eternal fire, shaped by his rage and the irreversibility of his choice. There, in the blazing ruins, what remained of the morning star distorted into black flames. The archangel of light died. Satan, the adversary, the prince of darkness, was born, whose sole purpose would be to defy the one who had created him. The humiliation of the fall was the baptism of fire for the new sovereign of darkness. Satan rose amidst the flaming ashes of his new kingdom, his countenance now marked by a terrible beauty, the shadow of what he had been and the promise of what he would be, pure and calculated malice. His voice, once the most harmonious in heaven, now resounded with the harshness of fury and the echo of vengeance. He observed his legion, the fallen angels, whose lights had also been extinguished and transformed into dark and grotesque forms, and proclaimed his new gospel, the eternal challenge. "Here," he cried, with a conviction born of pain and hatred, "we will reign, even in exile. Our purpose will no longer be to worship, but to corrupt. The war against the divine plan has only begun, and we will use the weakest creation of the eternal as the battlefield." Ages passed in the reckoning of the ether, and Satan's fury did not diminish. It merely transformed into a patient and deadly strategy. The solemn narrator focuses on the Creator's pain, not for the loss of a servant, but for the corruption of a masterpiece. The Eternal, in his justice tempered by mercy, did not destroy the adversary, but confined him, allowing him for a time dominion over the abyss, so that free choice and its consequences might be fully manifested. Meanwhile, humanity's plan advanced. And in Eden, the creation of flesh and breath lived in innocence, oblivious to the lurking shadow. Satan saw in man's frailty and freedom of choice the perfect breach for his vengeance, the opportunity to defile the Eternal's new masterpiece and prove that perfect obedience was an illusion. The stage for the trial was the Garden of Delight, where temptation came not with thunder, but with the cunning and eloquence that only the ancient light-bearer could master. The adversary, disguised and subtle, did not question God's power, but his benevolence and his word. He planted doubt, the same seed that had ruined him, the suspicion that obedience was a restriction on freedom and knowledge. "You will be like God," whispered the ancient star, echoing his own fallen ambition. The narrator shows the pain of human choice, the first great betrayal that resounded like a lament in the heavens. Humanity, seduced by the promise of autonomous divinity, chose the path of disobedience, and with that, the shadow of the adversary gained a foothold in the world. The fall of man was Satan's first triumph, not a final victory, but the confirmation of his ability to corrupt creation. The world became a battlefield, and suffering, injustice, and death entered human experience as inevitable consequences of choice. The adversary established himself as the prince of this world, a title that gave him dominion over human weaknesses and malice. The epic narrator emphasizes that, even amidst desolation, the Creator did not abandon his creation. The promise of redemption was given, the seed of a woman who would crush the serpent's head, a design of triumph that Satan failed to fully discern, for his pride blinded him to the depth of divine love and sacrifice. He saw only a distant threat. The Eternal One saw the covenant and the inevitable victory. In the long and arduous saga of humanity, the adversary's influence manifested itself in every act of cruelty, in every murmur of idolatry, in every heart that closed itself to the light. Centuries passed, and the conflict between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent unfolded in the tapestry of history. The narrator focuses on pain and hope, the pain of trials that tested the faith of the righteous, and the hope nurtured by the prophecies of a liberator. Satan, in his arrogance, believed he could thwart the divine plan through oppression, tyranny, and cynicism, corrupting alliances and leading astray the chosen ones. He observed the promised lineage, waiting for the moment to annihilate it, confident that human frailty would be his greatest ally against omnipotence. The greatest manifestation of faith, however, always arose amidst the deepest adversity, like gold purified by fire. The Eternal One allowed trials not to destroy, but to refine his covenant, revealing that true strength does not reside in the absence of struggle, but in unwavering obedience amidst chaos. The adversary, in his perverse logic, saw pain as a sign of divine abandonment, unable to understand that the suffering of the righteous was, in truth, the crucible where fidelity was forged. Each humiliated prophet, each persecuted righteous person, and each silenced martyr in truth prepared the way for triumph, keeping alive the flame of the promise which burned more intensely in the darkness. And then, in the fullness of time, the eternal decree manifested itself in a way that defied all angelic and demonic logic. The Word, he who was in the beginning with God, would become flesh, being born in the humblest of human conditions. This act of divine humiliation was the greatest scandal to Satan's pride. The fallen light-bearer, who had demanded a throne in heaven, could not conceive that the Creator would choose a manger and a life of servitude. He saw weakness where there was incomparable power, and vulnerability where the greatest strategy of love and redemption resided. His malice intensified, focused on destroying the promised Messiah before the divine purpose could be fulfilled. The life of Christ was, from the beginning, a chronicle of trial and obedience, a vivid contrast to the saga of Lucifer. While the fallen archangel had exchanged service for sovereignty, the Son of God exchanged sovereignty for service. The epic narrator highlights the test of faith in the desert, where the adversary, in his former glory as tempter, confronted the Redeemer. Satan offered him the kingdoms and glory he had coveted for himself, using the same rhetoric of power and self-sufficiency that had ruined him. But Christ's response was not one of negotiation, but of unwavering divine word. "You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." The adversary was repelled, humbled by the faithfulness and perfect obedience of a God-man. With each miracle performed, and each teaching delivered by Christ, Satan's anger and dread grew. He watched the Messiah undo his works, free the captives from his dominion, and restore humanity's stolen dignity. The adversary realized that the Son of Man was not merely preaching, but dismantling the kingdom he had built upon disobedience and fear. His strategy shifted from seduction to annihilation. The narrator reveals the devil's desperation in using human frailty, the envy of religious leaders, the betrayal of friends, the skepticism of the masses as tools to silence the voice of truth and interrupt the fulfillment of prophecy. He incited cruelty, hoping that human injustice would accomplish the vengeance he could not achieve in heaven. The climax of Christ's earthly ordeal was his passion, the moment when human injustice and demonic malice converged. Satan, in his blind pride, believed he had perfectly manipulated events, the disciples' betrayal, the rigged trial, the condemnation by the crowd. He saw the cross not as an altar, but as a gallows, the final proof that the Creator had abandoned his Son and that the promise of redemption had failed. The epic narrator describes the adversary's dark jubilation, who felt victory in his hands, the evil satisfaction of seeing the light of the world humiliated, crushed, and silenced, exposed to opprobrium and the deepest pain. For the devil, Christ's death was the end of the covenant and the eternal triumph of his rebellion. But what seemed to be absolute defeat was, in fact, the revelation of divine purpose in its deepest form. The cross was not the end of the saga, but the ultimate test of faith, perfect obedience taken to the extreme of sacrifice. The Son of God not only died because of sin, but to destroy the power of sin and death, stripping the adversary of the dominion he had gained in Eden. The solemn narrator emphasizes that Satan, in his arrogance, failed to discern the mystery of love that gives itself completely. He had focused on pain and physical humiliation, failing to perceive that the death of the righteous one was the only price capable of redeeming the injustice of all humanity, fulfilling the promise to crush his head. In the darkness of the Sabbath, the trial reached its lowest point, the silence of the grave. The adversary, believing himself victorious, did not realize that Christ's descent into Sheol was not a surrender, but an invasion. The Eternal One had other plans, and the Son's faithfulness would be the hammer that would break the gates of death. The resurrection, the inevitable triumph of the promise, erupted like a supernova of justice and light. The body that had been humiliated was glorified, and death, Satan's last dominion, was swallowed up by victory. The adversary's shock was absolute. The humiliation of heaven had become triumph on earth, and the fallen light-bearer realized, with horror and fury, that his rebellion had been used to fulfill the plan he had so tried to destroy. The contrast of victory was striking, a cosmic shock that reversed the curse of Eden. The resurrected Christ, with the marks of glorified trial, walked in triumph, proving that the power of life overcame the tyranny of death. Where Satan had sown doubt, Christ planted the certainty of redemption. Where the adversary had brought separation, the Redeemer established the unbreakable covenant. The epic narrator describes the impotent fury of the devil and his hosts, who saw their dominion over fear and despair crumble. The triumph was not only over death. As we continue on this journey, subscribe and walk with us through each new tale, and leave a like to support Heroes of Faith. But over the very logic of rebellion, Lucifer's pride had led to defeat, but Christ's humility and obedience led to eternal glory and the liberation of humanity. With the ascension of Christ, divine justice was fully established, and the prophecy of an unshakable kingdom began to manifest. The Son, who had humbled himself unto death, was exalted above every name, and dominion over heaven and earth was given to him. Satan, the ancient ruler of light who had coveted a throne, saw the Messiah enthroned at the right hand of majesty, fulfilling the destiny that the fallen archangel had rejected. The triumph was not only the redemption of humanity, but the reordering of the cosmos, an eternal reminder that true authority emanates from faithfulness and not from ambition. The adversary was defeated in principle, although he was still allowed a limited time to manifest his fury. The legacy of Christ manifested itself in the formation of a new people, the Church, forged not by the force of swords, but by the power of the Spirit, and by unwavering faith in the resurrection. This new community, composed of frail and imperfect humans, became the living testimony to the defeat of Satan. The adversary now concentrated his malice on the persecution and internal corruption of this new covenant, using the same tactic of seduction and doubt to sow discord and deviation from the truth. The solemn narrator emphasizes that the trial did not cease, but changed form, from a direct confrontation to a war of spiritual resistance, where the perseverance of the faithful would become the continuous test of faith and the proof of Christ's final victory. In that new season of struggles and triumphs, the divine purpose was revealed more clearly. Trial was the path to glory, and faith was the only armor the adversary could not penetrate. The saga of Lucifer, from angel of light to prince of darkness, served as an eternal warning against pride and self-sufficiency, while the saga of Christ, from sovereign to servant, served as the model of redemption and triumph. The contrast between the two destinies was the very essence of the story's moral. The most beautiful angel fell for wanting to be equal to God. The Son of God humbled himself and was exalted. Divine justice was not merely punishment, but the exaltation of humility and perfect obedience. Satan's fate, though sealed by the cross and the resurrection, still unfolded in time, marked by his growing indignation and impotent fury. The omniscient narrator describes the torment of the adversary, who was forced to witness the advancement of the kingdom of God through the faith of mere mortals, whom he had despised. Each soul redeemed, each act of forgiveness, and each manifestation of love and unity among the redeemed was a spear in the heart of his pride. What he saw as God's greatest weakness, love for humankind, revealed itself to be his greatest strength, the glue that bound heaven and earth in an unbreakable new covenant. The final prophecy outlined the inevitable outcome, a future where divine justice would be consummated and the dominion of evil would finally be extinguished. The adversary, aware of his limited time, intensified the persecution, transforming the last days into a period of great trial for the faithful. He attempted, with desperate tactics, to imitate divine power and authority, seeking to divert worship to himself and annihilate the witness of the church. The solemn narrator insists that, even in this period of chaos and deception, God's faithfulness and promise of protection remained the anchor of the righteous, the reminder that victory was already assured. The final triumph of Christ will be visible and absolute, a return in glory that will leave no room for doubt or skepticism. The same heaven that witnessed the fall of the rebellious archangel and the ascension of the Redeemer will be the audience for the consummation of the eternal plan. On that day, the transformation will be complete. The righteous will be resurrected in glorified bodies, the restored image of human perfection that Lucifer had tried to corrupt in Eden. This will be the physical manifestation of the after of the trial, a vivid contrast to the before of the fall, where pain and mortality will be banished forever. The triumph of faith will be the eternity of peace and justice, and Satan's final destiny will be the most severe of divine justices, eternal banishment to the lake of fire, a place prepared not for man, but for the devil and his angels. The former light-bearer, who coveted worship and power, will be stripped of all his glory and confined, not for vengeance but for the necessity of restoring cosmic order. The shock and belated repentance of his hosts, who will realize the folly of their rebellion and the depth of their error, will be the final note of his saga. The narrator concludes that Lucifer's legacy is proof that pride is self-destruction and that sovereignty is a privilege that can only be exercised in perfect obedience and love. Indignation at the injustice of the fall will be replaced by the satisfaction of redemption and final justice. The story of Lucifer, the fallen star, and the saga of Christ, the exalted Redeemer, form the great epic of the cosmos, a tale of warning and hope. The eternal lesson lies in the primordial choice, pride that destroys beauty and humility that leads to exaltation. The solemn narrator invites the reader to contemplate the majesty of divine intervention, which transforms the greatest betrayal into the greatest triumph, the pain of trial. The apparent solitude of the righteous and the malice of the antagonists are merely instruments used by the higher design to mold an outcome of unparalleled glory, where fidelity is rewarded and rebellion is justly silenced. The narrative should inspire reverence for the power that, in an act of incomprehensible love, allowed the Creator's trial to become the redemption of the creature. Indignation at the injustice of angelic arrogance and human frailty should be overcome by the satisfaction of the victory of faith, which guarantees that darkness is temporary and light is eternal. The triumph of Christ is the guarantee that the promise is not merely a consolation, but an inevitable fulfillment, a decree that not even the greatest rebel can annul. The narrative reaches its climax by showing that transformation is not a casual event, but the logical and necessary result of faithfulness to the covenant. Contrast is at the heart of this epic. The archangel who sought to be God and became the shadow, the God who became man and became king forever. The malice and skepticism of the antagonists, from Satan to the men who crucified him, were the fuel that, ironically, propelled the fulfillment of the prophecy. The narrator emphasizes that the satisfactory outcome does not lie in the elimination of the struggle, but in the certainty that the struggle of the righteous has a purpose, and that suffering, when lived in obedience, transforms into a portal to unspeakable glory and the restoration of all things. Thus, the chronicle of Lucifer and Christ is a tale of justice that elevates the moral of the story to a cosmic level. The account concludes with the vision of one who, through faith, overcomes the power of the adversary, not by his own strength, but through the covenant with the victorious one. Spiritual transformation is the inheritance of the faithful, the reflection of the restored light, and proof that the plan of redemption is stronger than the most beautiful of rebellions. The ancestral saga of trial and triumph echoes like a hymn of hope, an invitation to reverence and unwavering trust in the eternal design. The legacy of Christ, therefore, is not limited to the memory of his deeds, but to his continuous presence, a covenant manifested in the perseverance of the righteous. The narrator focuses on the atmosphere of trial that permeates the present times, where the malice of Satan is expressed in subtle doubt and the temptation to abandon faith. The adversary, knowing that he can no longer win the cosmic war, dedicates himself to winning individual battles, seeking to undermine man's confidence in the promise and justice of the Creator. But the word of Christ, living and effective, is the shield against the rhetoric of the enemy, and the hope of resurrection is the beacon that illuminates the path even in the nights of greatest darkness and apparent solitude. The contrast between the before and after of the trial is the experience of every redeemed soul. The before is servitude to fear and sin, the echo of the curse of Eden. The after is the freedom of conscience, the peace that transcends understanding, and the certainty of divine filiation. The epic narrator describes the transformation vividly and in stark contrast. The heart of stone turned into a heart of flesh, the vision clouded by pride, replaced by the clarity of humility, the burden of guilt exchanged for the lightness of forgiveness. This spiritual metamorphosis is irrefutable proof of Christ's victory, a silent testimony that confounds and enrages the adversary more than any celestial army. In the chronological line of overcoming, the Church established itself as the body that manifests the resilience of faith. The narrative focuses on the description of persecution and martyrdom, acts of cruelty incited by the fury of Satan, who attempts, through physical suffering, to break the spirit of the covenant. However, the skepticism of the oppressors and the pain of the faithful serve only to refine the testimony, proving that faith is stronger than death. The martyrs, in their final humiliation, echo the obedience of Christ, and their death is seen by the narrator as a triumph, not a defeat, for it seals the promise of future glory. The narrator's eloquent language soars in describing the certainty of the future. Triumph is an inevitable fulfillment, engraved in the decree of the eternal even before the foundation of the worlds. The saga of Lucifer, though tragic, is a footnote in the great volume of redemption, a necessary element to demonstrate the depth of free choice and the glory of divine justice. The story is not about the strength of the adversary, but about the unwavering faithfulness of the Creator, who did not yield to pride and did not bend to the threat, but fulfilled his word with a love that transcends angelic and human understanding. The focus on the fate of the fallen light-bearer, now Satan, serves as a darkened mirror for humanity. The malice and skepticism that consumed him are the same temptations he uses to afflict the righteous. The narrator reveals the adversary's innermost thoughts, the belief that if he could corrupt the most beautiful of angels, he will surely succeed in leading astray the frail beings of clay. This skepticism regarding humanity's capacity for perseverance is his weakness, for he underestimates the power of grace and the covenant established by blood. He cannot conceive that obedience and love could be stronger than ambition and power. The narrative must evoke a reverence, born from a clear visualization of the before and after. The before is the glory of Lucifer, the morning star, who in his pride became absolute darkness, and the after is the ascension of the humble servant Christ, who in his obedience became the eternal light. The drama is heightened by the contrast between cosmic fall and earthly exaltation, showing that the paths of power and humility lead to opposite destinies. The satisfaction of the victory of faith is the realization that, in the end, justice is not merely the punishment of evil, but the glorification of good. The atmosphere of trial is filled with the context of waiting. The reader is placed on the chronological timeline of events of overcoming between the resurrection and the consummation. The solemn narrator uses the figure of Satan, the adversary, as the dramatic element that intensifies the need for unwavering faith. The devil is not inert. He is the roar that seeks to devour, the temptation that seeks to lead astray. But the faithfulness of Christ is the foundation that cannot be shaken, and the promise of his return is the impetus for perseverance, transforming waiting into a continuous and glorious test of faith. The transformation is not only spiritual, but also physical in the final prophecy. The triumph will not only be the redemption of the soul, but the restoration of the body and the cosmos. The narrator describes the destruction of Satan's kingdom as an inevitable fulfillment, an outcome where evil will be banished forever and justice and peace will reign without interruption. The shock and repentance of the adversary and his hosts upon seeing the fulfillment of the promise they desperately tried to thwart will be the final proof that the higher will always prevails, sealing the epic with the seal of omnipotence. The narrative needs to immerse the reader in visualizing the turning point of destiny. The final scene is not one of balanced battle, but of absolute authority. Christ, the just judge, does not return to negotiate, but to rule. The epic narrator describes the terror of the adversary, who, despite all his power and age-old cunning, is confronted with the undeniable reality. His rebellion was not a threat, but a note in the symphony of redemption, a means to manifest the depth of sacrificial love. Satan's fury transforms into a chilling dread, the recognition that each act of malice only paved the way for his own condemnation and the glory of the Redeemer. Divine justice manifests itself in the condemnation of the devil, not as an act of blind wrath, but as the restoration of the cosmic order violated by pride. The eternal fire, once shaped by Lucifer's rage, is now the site of his final humiliation. The solemn narrator emphasizes that this is not an arbitrary punishment, but the logical and inevitable consequence of his choice for a throne separate from the source of light. The light-bearer is confined to the darkness he himself chose, and the contrast is complete. The most radiant of celestial beings becomes the eternal representation of darkness and disobedience. The reader's satisfaction is the contemplation of the perfection of the judgment. The legacy of Christ's faithfulness and obedience, the model for humanity, is the final counterpoint to Lucifer's saga. While the fallen archangel left behind skepticism and death, the Redeemer left the covenant of life and the promise of a kingdom of justice. The narrator describes the transformation of the faithful, the after of the trial, as the fulfillment of the prophecy. Incorruptible bodies, minds free from deception, and hearts full of adoration, the army of the humble whom the adversary never managed to completely corrupt, proving that faith in God is the most powerful force in the universe. The moral of the story is elevated to its highest expression. True freedom resides in obedience, and the greatest power lies in sacrificial humility. The narrative avoids empty philosophies, focusing instead on the journey of transformation and the vivid contrast of victory. The saga of Lucifer, the being who refused to serve, is the backdrop for the epic of Christ, he who served unto death. Divine justice is the manifestation of truth, and redemption is the triumph of the covenant over rebellion. The narrative concludes with the certainty that the trial was merely a prelude to eternal glory. The narrator's eloquent and melodramatic language reaches its peak in describing the final scene of the redemption, where drama gives way to majesty. The contrast of victory is sealed with the eradication of all tears and pain, and the establishment of the new heaven and the new earth, a cosmos purified of the stain of pride and disobedience. This is the after that infinitely surpasses the before, the fulfilled promise of a return to innocence. But with the wisdom of the trial overcome, the glory of the redeemed is an eternal insult to the pride of Satan, for it demonstrates that the creation of clay, through faith, achieved what the most beautiful archangel rejected out of ambition. The shock and repentance of the fallen angels upon witnessing the incorruptibility of the righteous are detailed by the narrator. Their skepticism is finally crushed by the reality of a God who fulfills every word of his prophecy. They understand, too late, that the strength they sought in power and autonomy resided in faithfulness and obedience. Their pain is not one of remorse, but of impotent fury, the recognition that, by defying eternal authority, they only ensured their own downfall and the exaltation of him whom they despised. The figure of the adversary, once so imposing, is reduced to its essence as a defeated enemy. The narrator describes him in his final humiliation, the terror in his eyes, the rage contained in his distorted form, the realization that all his acts of wickedness were ultimately subservient to the divine purpose. The reader's indignation at injustice is finally resolved by the vision of evil confined, and the satisfaction of victory is the certainty that the principle of pride has been defeated by the principle of humility. The narrative, constructed as a historical chronicle of redemption, focuses on the acts of spiritual transformation. Christ's trial and humiliation led to the ultimate test of faith. The revelation of divine purpose was manifested on the cross. The covenant and protection were sealed in the resurrection, and triumph and faithfulness will be consummated at his return. The legacy and the final prophecy unite in the vision of an endless kingdom where divine justice is not merely a concept but the atmosphere that permeates all eternity. The solemn language and epic tone of the narrator unite in a final invitation to reverence. The reader is called upon to feel the majesty of divine intervention, which not only saves but radically transforms. The saga of Lucifer, the light-bearer who was extinguished, and the saga of Christ, the God-man who became the light of the world, are the pillars of faith, an ancient tale that elevates morality and inspires perseverance in trial, for the ending is already written and is one of ineffable glory. Triumph, therefore, is not a casual event, but the inevitable fulfillment of the promise, the manifestation of God's faithfulness amidst the greatest adversity. The transformation is complete, the contrast is vivid, and justice is absolute. The account concludes with the echo of the final verdict. a note of triumph that resonates throughout the cosmos. Pride has been banished, humility has been exalted, and faith, tested in the fire of tribulation, has received the crown of life. The story of divine trial, faith, and triumph is complete. The tale ends, but faith lives on. Subscribe, like, and be part of this mission to keep the light of truth burning.